Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to New Books in Gender Studies, a channel on the New Books Network. I'm here with fashion historian Eleanor Medhurst to talk about her new book, Unsuitable, A History of Lesbian Fashion, out this year, right now, 2024, with Oxford University Press. Hello, Ellie. How are you?
Hi, I'm amazing, thank you. It's really good to be here.
Yeah, congratulations on the book.
Thank you. Yeah, so exciting.
Oh, it really is, right? And you said you have a proof copy right in front of you.
Yes.
There.
Yes, I have it in my hands.
It's so exciting with its fabulous cover. Yeah, so because it's a lot of work, right? How long have you been thinking about lesbians and fashion?
A long time, honestly. I've been working on this book since autumn 2021, but I've been gathering the research, doing the work since before that. I have a blog, dressingdykes.com, where I've been posting since summer 2020 about the history of lesbian fashion in like little bite-sized articles. So it's sort of the culmination of all of that work.
Yeah. But how did you get interested in this? What sparked your interest in lesbian fashion?
Well, so I went to university for my BA in fashion and dress history at the University of Brighton. So obviously I was thinking about, I was thinking about fashion history and sort of subcultural styles and clothes worn by minority groups. And obviously I'm a lesbian, so like queer people's fashion was something that I looked into a lot in that time. And I did a master's in history of design and material culture, also at the University of Brighton, where I focused even more on like lesbian fashion. I started looking at Anne Lister's fashion then, who I'm sure we might talk about later because she comes up in the book. And yeah, so it was this, I was doing all this work at university towards different areas of lesbian fashion, writing essays, like doing the research. But at the same time, I was also involved with a exhibition that was put on at Brighton Museum. It's actually still going, called Queer Looks, which was a display of around 20 outfits from the local LGBTQ community from Brighton in the UK. And yeah, being part of that team and sort of thinking about the importance of queer fashion for the queer community today, thinking about the importance of like preserving these stories that go with these various queer looks. It just really made me think about how important that is to so many people and to sort of preserve those histories. So yeah, it all kind of stemmed from those things and grew and grew.
So it feels like it's an academic and a personal interest that kind of married and
absolutely,
and then felt important. Yeah, I mean, the first line of the book is fashion history is about people. And I wanted to hear what you had to say, particularly after, learning that this is so much about kind of your story and your life is situated in it as well. What does it mean? Can you elaborate on this idea?
I think that a lot of people look at fashion and fashion history as being something that's about sort of couture and really rich people, royalty, celebrities, like very high-end fashion, and that it's not necessarily to do with the everyday person's life, and that fashion history in that way is almost kind of frivolous and doesn't speak to history as a wider phenomenon and to social histories, when it absolutely does, because we all get dressed every day. We all choose the clothes that we wear, whether we're going, oh, I want it to be really fashionable, I want to wear unique clothes, I want to fit in with a community, or I just want to be practical. We're all making those choices, and we're all sort of thinking about the people that we meet based off of the clothes that they wear and the way that they present themselves. So fashion is entirely about people and about social histories, and it can tell us so much about the world at any given point, really.
Yeah. And as you know, lesbian fashion would have been considered almost oxymoronic is a term for most of history, right? What is it tell us about lesbians and why this book needs to exist?
Well, the thing is with lesbian fashion, as you said, it's not really been seen as being a thing because the sort of stereotype is that lesbians are unfashionable. But even that is important within a sort of documentation of clothing. But when you look at queer history and even just queer fashion history, even within that, lesbians don't have a space because their clothes sometimes aren't necessarily as extravagant or fashionable TM, you know? So for me, as a lesbian and as a fashion historian, I was aware that hardly anyone was really looking at this as an important area of study when it absolutely is, because obviously, as I said, fashion can really help you connect with a certain group's history and the ways that that group's community is formed. It's sort of a language, you know, that helps you to understand a community and a history.
Mm-hmm. And it was hard to get at this topic. A lot of people a lot of women that we would identify as lesbians are just lost in history. People are lost in history. Women are lost. Poor people are lost. Yet more lesbians. So how did you go about finding your subjects?
Yeah, I mean, that's sometimes quite a difficult thing because if you're looking at more recent history, it obviously becomes slightly easier to look at lesbian subjects and consequently the clothes that they wear and the way that they express themselves visually, because you have things like photos, you have more written documents, maybe surviving letters, things like magazines and stuff like that more recently that you can use. You have a much wider range of sources. And then the further back you go, obviously people still existed who were, whether they might have used the term lesbian or not, who were people that we can include in a lesbian history because of the way that they lived their lives. All of these people still existed. They were still making choices with the clothes that they wore, but it's harder to find out about not just their lives, but what they were wearing. So when you go further and further back, you do sort of find yourself looking at more wealthy individuals, royalty, landowners, primarily white people as well, just because often those are the people who have kept diaries about their lives and their clothes and their experiences, and who we have maybe paintings of. So yeah, it's sort of like trying to balance having a wide range of representations that reflect real life lesbian history, but also using the resources that are actually still around.
Yeah. I mean, it's something we're talking about a lot, something we're talking a lot about in history is that the process of archiving as well. Like these are people who had the means to keep diaries that people talked about, and then we preserved their things as well. So there's this process where it's harder to get at people. But you really, like, to use an Americanism, you like swing for the fences. That's a baseball term. And if I had my head together, I would have come up with a better one. But you really, anyway, you like swing for the fences early on. You're talking about Sappho. And I have no idea how we're going to get, like, I was like, Sappho, how are we going to figure out what she wore? But how do you do this, and why start here, and how did you handle Sappho?
I think sometimes I'm looking at like lesbian fashion history through the lens of how has someone kind of influenced later people and stuff like that, rather than what did Sappho wear, because hardly any of the poet Sappho from ancient Greece, hardly any of her poems actually survive. They survive in fragments. So if you're trying to think about what clothes she wore, you're kind of at a dead end. So how I approached Sappho was the way that she's been sort of reclaimed and reinvented, and how the sapphic look has formed, and what people think Sappho wore, and how they then dress to kind of copy that. So I wanted to start with Sappho because Sappho's such a sort of, she's the landmark of lesbian history, basically. Sappho is the root of the term sapphic and lesbian. She lived on the island of Lesbos, so both of those words are references to her. And there are so many points in lesbian history where people have been deliberately referencing her, such as in 1920s Paris, where a whole lesbian community was like in love with Sappho and would reinterpret her poems and bring violets into their everyday lives and their dress, because Sappho wrote about violets in her poetry alongside writing about love for women. So sometimes it's sort of, it's not a strict, these are the historical individuals and this is what they wore. It's like, why does their image matter? Why does their self-fashioning and the way that they've been interpreted by others, why does that matter? So yeah, it's not sort of as strict as here's Sappho's clothes.
Right. So it's about kind of the community, you know. So I mean, something that we're going to talk about more is this symbiotic relationship kind of between lesbian community and lesbian fashion.
Yeah.
And how, you know, it's a dialectic that, you know, a lesbian community because of the way they dress, and they dress so, you know, right?
Yeah.
That's fair.
Yeah, definitely. That's a big theme.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about Queen Christina, whose dress I learned about from you. Thanks. So she's quite famous. Tell us, who is this woman?
So Queen Christina was she was officially the king of Sweden in the 17th century. And she only ruled for about 10 years before she abdicated the throne because she wanted a much more free life. She wanted to move to Rome. She didn't want to marry. A very strong part of why she didn't want to rule was because she didn't want to produce heirs. And she sort of was very interesting because she never did what people sort of wanted her to do. She never did what was expected of her in the way that she acted, in the clothes that she wore, in the people that we might think that she loved. She wrote letters, romantic seeming letters to many women, including her lady in waiting, I'll say. It's not the correct term, but I can't think of what her official title was, called Ebba Spar. And this was a woman who Christina called Belle because she was so beautiful, or Christina thought she was so beautiful. So she's sort of been, she's been claimed by many lesbians and in lesbian history for a long, long time. Even if she was a lesbian or not, she still is part of that lesbian history. And then she becomes part of lesbian fashion history because the clothes that she wore were so interesting. She often mixed male and female clothing, whether traditional Swedish clothing or more fashionable Parisian clothing. She sometimes she would wear very feminine gowns, and other times she'd be wearing things that were quite scruffy. And yeah, there's just a lot to be said about her and the way that she did what she wanted, really.
Yeah. And this interesting mix of clothing, like that would be clear symbols of masculinity, right, on top of a dress, say. And yeah, it's very this clear subversion, and she clearly knows what she's doing, right? Yeah. This is her goal.
Yeah, well, she was very interested in fashion, actually. Like, while she was on the Swedish throne, she was trying to get as many cultural imports from like Paris, including clothing, as she could. And she wasn't able to be like a sort of a soldier monarch, which is a role that her father really had in the 30 Years' War in Europe. So instead, she wanted to be this cultural leader. Because she was a woman, she couldn't be a soldier in the same way. But yeah, so she was very in tune with fashion. She was very aware of it. And in surviving portraits of her, you can tell that she's very intentional in the way that she crafts her image, wearing men's shirts and stuff like that. Or her favorite portrait of herself was her on horseback in riding wear, which was kind of the most masculine clothing that women could like socially acceptably wear in Sweden at the time. So yeah, she knew what she was doing, definitely.
Yeah, and this is a thing you note throughout the book. And there are spaces where it's acceptable for women to dress in masculine clothing, right? And riding would be one of those.
Yeah, riding, for hundreds of years was a space where women could wear clothes that were more masculine. And then if you were wearing like a riding habit, for example, which might include a top hat, might include a jacket that's sort of military inspired, those were things that women might then wear sometimes in their everyday, but that's kind of stretching the boundaries of what was acceptable. So sporting environments and riding environments were very important in lesbian fashion history because it gave masculine lesbians a space where they could dress in a masculine way and for it to be okay.
Yeah, it's also just a space where women get to go and be alone and outside.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And just be free, be out of the constraints of the home, do something physical.
Yeah, like, horses and then bicycles. Very important. So we've got this Queen Christina hunting things. And then that leads me, I'm thinking about Anne Lister. Right. The very famous, like, mother of all lesbians in Britain, it seems.
Yeah, she's often called the first modern lesbian.
Or Radcliffe Hall and Una Trowbridge. Let's talk about their style, like these kind of, this subset of lesbian fashion.
Yeah. So Radcliffe Hall and Una Trowbridge Radcliffe Hall was the author of what's also considered the first lesbian novel called The Well of Loneliness. And in the 1920s, when her career was really taking off, bear in mind, both of these people were very wealthy. Obviously, Lady Una Trowbridge, they had quite a lot of privilege. But during the 1920s, when they were really quite prominent social figures, they were seen as very fashionable and very sort of cutting edge, while they were dressing in a way that seems so, so gay today. Because in the 1920s, there was a fashion for boyish fashions, for modernist fashions, which often included very short haircuts, tailored jackets, ties, but normally paired with a skirt so that it had that last boundary of acceptability of wearing a skirt rather than trousers or pants. But yeah, so they were very sort of prominent figures in modernist, boyish fashion communities in the 1920s, but also in lesbian communities because of Radcliffe Hall writing The Well of Loneliness, because of the circles they moved in, because they used the term sexual inverts to describe themselves, which was something that was beginning to be popularized at the turn of the 20th century. The term sexual inverts or inversion was sort of the popular thing to describe homosexuality, basically. Though not everybody liked it. Some people went, no, I'm not an invert, I'm a lesbian. There was sort of a war with these different terms going on at the time within queer communities. But yeah, they were really influential in sort of bridging the gap between things that were fashionable in mainstream culture that were also fashionable in lesbian or invert culture.
How much of that is about like a pointed subversion of like these tropes, right? They're pointedly wearing masculine clothing as a demonstration of their identity, Or is it just fashion? Is there just fashion? I don't know.
Yeah. Well, the thing with those two is that they did continue to dress in very much the same way even after those fashions went out of fashion. And Radcliffe Hall in particular was quite instrumental in those fashions, in boyish modernist fashions going out of fashion, because after the Well of Loneliness included descriptions of clothes worn by the protagonist, who was a masculine lesbian, who was an invert, who wore quite similar clothes to those that Radcliffe Hall would wear. And when the novel was then banned in the UK and in many other places, people were starting to look at it and going, oh, that's a lesbian. That's what lesbians wear. So it's not really a coincidence that sort of coincided with those fashions starting to become less fashionable. But then Radcliffe Hall and Una Trowbridge continued to wear them, but because they were upper class, because they had money, they were it was allowed. They were just eccentric.
Right. They can do whatever they wanted.
Exactly. Like Queen Christina.
Yeah. It's wealth is kind of its own gender, right? The rules are very different for very wealthy people.
Yeah.
And so I think this takes us, like, there's kind of a natural step into talking about the trans fashion of the Weimar.
Yeah.
Talk to me about that.
Absolutely. So something that I really, really thought was important to include in this book about lesbian history was trans lesbians, especially because of the political climate, with trans people not being included within the lesbian community by some people, etc., transphobia all over the place. But it's important that trans people, whether trans men or trans lesbians, are in this history because they're very much part of it. The thing with when you're looking at trans lesbians in history is that they're harder to find because they're not necessarily labeled in that way. They're called perhaps male transvestites, and you have to look for the signs that would they have identified with part of a lesbian community. And a time when this was very evident was in the Weimar period in Germany. There was a whole wealth of there were a few lesbian publications that were actually quite accessible and easy to buy at this time. And many of them included articles specifically for people who were called transvestites and who identified with the term transvestites. And even when specific articles, specific publications that catered primarily to these transvestite communities started to be published, many of the people in these transvestite communities continued to buy the lesbian magazines. So it really shows that affiliation between them. And I was really interested in the articles in these magazines just because, as I was talking about earlier, you often don't have records of people in less represented communities, people who aren't perhaps as wealthy, but in these magazines you really do. And a lot of them talk about clothing, because of course they do, because people are like, how am I going to express myself? How am I going to make myself legible to my community and to show I'm one of you and to feel comfortable in the clothes that I'm wearing? So in the Weimar period, there's just a wealth of information about clothes that people were wearing. And this was the modernist period. It was the 1920s. It was very similar clothes that Radcliffe Hall was wearing that were being talked about in these magazines, and that the trans lesbians of Weimar Berlin were wearing too. So it's a really fascinating time to look at, and I'm so grateful that the publications exist, that they've been shared online. They are actually accessible to look at online, thanks to some very hardworking people in archives. So yeah. Yes,
thank you so much. It's so nice to be able to access these things at will at home. it makes a huge difference kind of than the amount that we're able to talk about this.
Exactly.
So we've got these kind of Radcliffe Hall, very masculine, like a lot of like traditionally masculine clothes that are being that are fashionable in the 20s, and then in the Weimar, like the end of the Weimar brings an end to this, right? Very pointedly because of the rise of the Nazis. Like something really specific happens in Germany. But this kind of masculine fashion, it falls out of fashion in the 30s and 40s, kind of all over, yeah?
Yeah, there's definitely a move back into femininity. Obviously, many lesbian communities, many people continue to wear more masculine clothes, but the sort of being able to blend into popular culture isn't as much of a thing.
Right. And then we get and then we move into the mid-century, where there's still a lot of well, you call it your butch femme interlude. Let's talk about your butch femme interlude.
Yeah. So the thing with butch and femme is that it's probably the most well-documented area in lesbian history, and especially in lesbian fashion history, because it's a very identifiable community and period. It's quite easy to talk about in terms of fashion sometimes, because it's like butch, masculine, femme, feminine. So I was giving it its own space. It's right in the middle of the book, but I didn't want to focus on it loads and loads. I wanted to give kind of an overview and a discussion of it. So butch and femme was something that really emerged in the mid-20th century, though it had sort of predecessors. Is that right? Is predecessors the people before? Yeah.
Yes.
I just had a moment of self-doubt. I was like, before this, like with sexual inverts, who I mentioned earlier, would often be this conception of one of them would be more masculine and one of them would be more feminine. But with butch and femme, these relationships and communities were largely centered in lesbian bar communities, especially in North America and in the UK as well. And it wasn't as universal as it's sometimes thought. Sometimes people will consider lesbian bar communities of the mid-century to be all butch and femme. Everyone is always either butch, very masculine, or femme and very feminine, and in their actions play into those roles or stereotypes as well. But often it was a lot more complex than this. People would maybe be butch one day, femme another. They wouldn't be either of them. They might look very butch, but they might not be fixing the car and doing all the work. Often the femme would be the breadwinner, because a feminine woman could more easily find a job than someone who is very masculine. So yeah, it's a very complicated topic, but it's also one that has so much to talk about in terms of clothes, because so many people were in these bar communities, and because we're getting closer to the current day, there's more sort of people who have done oral histories with members of these communities, people who have done interviews. So we have so much more evidence about people talking about their suits that they would wear to the bars, to their little black dresses, talking about their handbags or their bouffants if they're femmes, or talking about their ducktail haircuts and their winkle picker shoes if they were butches, and people talking about how they didn't really feel like they were either, or maybe they felt like they had to be one or another so that they'll fit in. So yeah, it's a really, really sort of staple part of lesbian fashion history.
It's very, it's very rich, and it talks about, you can see here the place where people feel like they can put on a costume and go play in their safe space, right? At these lesbian bars. Right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, lesbian bars wouldn't always be safe, especially in, they were often very working class spaces. And that means that, especially in the US, the police would target them very unfairly, and that you couldn't always be sure if you were going to be safe there, but you were safer there than in other places if you were expressing yourself as a lesbian. Right. So yeah, they were very much like havens, but also sometimes not.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes very physically dangerous, which it often is dangerous in particular to be butch.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And, because then there's a femme is acceptable, butch is transgressive.
Yeah. Because, as a woman, you're expected to be feminine, and femmes aren't just, often they're not just dressing or acting the same as a typical stereotypical heterosexual woman would, but they can blend in to heteronormative society more easily, whereas for a butch it's much harder to do that.
Yeah, there's no heteronormative. There might be passing in the other direction. There might be women who are passing as men.
Yeah, definitely.
But that's dangerous too, yeah?
Yeah, because it's like, well, what if someone finds you out? What's going to happen, if you're caught to be this like transgressor, really?
Yeah, and there's this very long history. Shakespeare's plays are full of women dressing as men in order to access spaces where they're not supposed to be, or to go out in the world safely.
Yeah, definitely. A long, long history of that.
But it's never quite okay, right?
Yeah.
Which I want to talk about, like how this kind of a traditional like mid-century butch look differs from but feeds into the modern this modern drag king phenomenon.
Yeah, definitely. Well, a lot of people who I might read as butch when looking at their clothes and their self-expression, whether they might have used that label or not, have also been drag kings or male impersonators. And male impersonation is an industry that's been going for, as you said, hundreds of years because of with women dressing as men or boys on stage for the theatre, for the opera. They're often called breeches roles. It was a whole phenomenon. And then in the 19th century, male impersonation started to be a character type on vaudeville or on variety stages in the music hall in the UK. And there were lots of performers who made really big names for themselves by being male impersonators and having this male character on stage. And not all, but some of them were also wearing very masculine clothing in their everyday life too. And into the it lasts so long because you have this lineage of male impersonators from the 1700s, the 1800s, into the 1920s and the Harlem Renaissance. You have looming figures like Gladys Bentley. You have in the mid 20th century drag kings like Stormy Delivery, who only passed away in 2014 and then was part of these more modern drag communities too. So it's a lineage that stretches all the way from now to hundreds and hundreds of years ago.
I'm really seeing this idea that there's like it's so this transgression is so liminal, right? It's safe until it isn't. It's acceptable until it isn't. Yeah.
And often it's like it's acceptable if you're a really successful male impersonator, and it's like, oh, but you're allowed to transgress gender norms. You're allowed to wear male clothing on the street because it's just your character. You're just being quirky. You're just being your character. If you're Radcliffe Hall and you've got lots of money and you're a bit eccentric, you're allowed to wear more masculine clothing even when it's not fashionable anymore because, that's just your character almost again. So, but if you don't have those ifs and buts and that safety net, then the rug can be pulled out from under you. And going back to butch and femme, for example, in the mid-century in the US, particularly in New York, there was a law known as the three-piece clothing law, which was originally conceived as an idea to try and stop like masked disguised robberies and stuff like that, but instead sort of morphed into this way to persecute queer people and to persecute people who were dressing in clothes that were different from the clothes that their perceived gender should be wearing. And for butch lesbians, that was something that would often land them in prison, or even just for the night, even if there was no specific evidence against them, just because it was an easy way to persecute them. So yeah, there could be a lot of danger tied up with dressing in a masculine way.
Mm-hmm. And particularly, yeah, if it's just one of you, you're a quirky person. If there's a community of people, then this is a social threat, it feels as well, right? Yeah. So I want to talk you. One of my favorite quotes is that I've read before, that outrageousness was an expression of outrage.
Yeah.
Right. So we've been talking about this as kind of as fashion, as a social like a social idea, as a way to create community. But there are strong political implications here as well, right?
Absolutely. It's a way often to be like, I do not want to be what you think I should be. And for women who are so often and throughout so much of history sort of forced to be a feminine wife and mother, whether they want to be or not, to do otherwise can be very politically relevant. It can be very revolutionary. It can be very empowering as well. And, again, it always can have that sense of danger, but it's something that for a long, long time has been very powerful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, the suffragettes had a particular way of dressing, for instance. But you talk about kind of the dyke uniform, and making air quotes here, the dyke uniform.
Yeah.
Which is also a political act, yeah?
Yeah. So, in the lesbian feminist movement, which kind of stemmed from the women's movement and the feminist movement in the 60s, 70s, 80s, there became this thing called the androgynous uniform, or in lesbian communities, sometimes the dyke uniform, which was this more androgynous way of dressing, which is sort of moving away from the femininity that women are expected to have. And that wasn't always a good thing, because sometimes these communities who were dressing in this more androgynous way would then vilify people from butch and femme communities who were often also working class, because they weren't doing the apparently politically right thing to be doing, if they're being too gendered. But it was equally a very important thing, like having this dyke uniform, this androgynous uniform, this being able to not be desirable in the way that you appear is something that has really changed so many people's lives still,
Mm-hmm. Just the sheer audacity of not dressing for the male gaze.
Exactly.
Pretty profound. Hey, I've taken up tons of your time, and we've gone from Sappho to the drag king. So I think we're ready to go. So I've just got one more question, which is what's next for you? Are you going to write another book? What are you doing?
Yes. So I'm working on some ideas for another book, also about queer history, visual culture, things like that. I don't really want to say more. That I'm still thinking about that. I'm going to continue to talk about lesbian fashion history online, as I have already been doing, so that people can really access it and learn about it. There's so much research is behind paywalls and stuff like that, so it's really important to me that research is accessible to people for free online. I'm just going to continue doing what I'm doing. I think there's so much of lesbian fashion history that I have yet to explore. There's a whole world out there, so I just want to keep digging, really.
Yeah. One thing I want to say before we hang up is this is an accessible book. Your writing style is very clear. and accessible. And you talk about some very heady feminist and queer theory, but you do it in a way that's really legible. And everyone should read this book. Like, this is not just for academics. This is a book you can give your aunt who has the friend that the family doesn't really talk about. She'll love this. Like, this book should go everywhere.
Yeah, thank you so much. It really means a lot to hear you say that.
Excellent. All right. So thank you so much for talking to me, Ellie listeners. This was Unsuitable, a history of lesbian fashion. And you can find a link to it on our website. And Ellie, and until next time, we'll talk to you about the next book.
Amazing. Thank you.